The law matters. Of course it does. Welcome once again. I'm Debbie Moraes, your host and moderator. As we tell you, this program continues to provide legal information, relevant examples, and practical assistance to help you with the law matters, because the law matters. A better understanding of the law makes you in a better position to handle legal issues that affect your family, your life, your business. As we present various topics, you may, in fact, decide that you can handle some issues yourself. If you decide to enlist a professional, our goal, of course, is to have you be prepared, as well as the counsel that you retain. Our goal is to help you save time, money, and to achieve the best possible results. And as always, we want to welcome and thank Attorney David Bazar from the Bazar & Associates law firm in East Providence, who continues to offer his insights and his legal information on the various topics that we cover. So today, the right to protest. It's protected under the First Amendment. It's smart to know your rights and your limits. There are rules, and many protesters have exercised those rights lately, and it's also been in a situation where other people's rights have been violated, whether they're innocent bystanders or property owners or even police officers. Also, protesters' rights have been violated, sometimes from police, as we know. Clearly, there is a need to balance public safety, public rights, and First Amendment rights. So the core freedoms that protect us can't be left unprotected by us. So what are those rules? What do you need to know? Who has the authority to quell public unrest? Is it local? Is it state? Is it federal? So many questions. We're going to have an occasion to examine the laws. They certainly are evolving, especially since Black Lives Matter in 2020 started protesting. So before you decide to protest and what you need to know if you get caught up and something goes wrong anyway, plenty to discuss. So let's talk about it, David. There have been plenty of reasons to protest, and we've seen some. As of this taping, most recently, the Canada truck drivers.
Okay.
They have a right to protest?
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney in the United States. I can't tell you the rules for sure in Canada, but I'm sure that they do.
So they have a right to speak out. They weren't happy about the COVID rules and mandates. People who live in Canada, the residents, weren't happy that they were protesting, so they didn't like that, but it doesn't matter. It does matter that they were making noise and they were disruptive. The people got an injunction to stop that. So generally speaking, when people protest, it's not always quiet. What are their rights?
So generally speaking, the right to protest is sort of protected, not sort of, it is protected in the United States under the First Amendment. The right of free speech, the right to assemble, the right to petition government and protest. So you have a right under the Constitution to protest. However, it's not an absolute right. For example, you cannot commit a crime under the guise of I'm exercising my constitutional rights, because if you're protesting and you're breaking windows and damaging other people's property, you're violating the law, whether you have the right to protest or not. So the right to assemble and free speech does not protect and give you a constitutional right to commit a crime.
I know on many occasions we've talked about someone not having the right to yell fire in the middle of a theater. But if someone ended up yelling or protesting and then pointing, "That's him, go get him, he did it," apparently that's not legal either. Why?
Well, it depends exactly what you're referring to, but the right to be loud, to drown out other people who are trying to counter-protest and be loud, that's protected. You're allowed to even say unpopular things. What you're not allowed to do is break the law, as I said before. So if you're pointing the finger at somebody and threatening that person's life or conspiring with other people to hurt somebody, that's not protected.
Until someone is hurt, how can you prove that they were hurt? You could say that they're likely to be hurt. Someone has to make that judgment call. Is that a legal issue, David?
Well, here's the situation. If you're saying that person needs to be hurt, we should all go and hurt that person, that is the beginning of a conspiracy to commit a crime. And then if you actually, or someone actually carries out what you've told them to do or have tried to conspire with them to do, then you have committed a crime.
Sounds right. So you do have the right to be noisy and loud, and that's part of the democratic society. We allow those things. During that Canada truck driver issue, there was also a time that traffic was brought to a crawl. We all know that there are supply chain issues even before that happened. Now there was even more of an issue.
Right.
What's legal there?
So you, when you protest, cannot disrupt the free flow of society. You can't interrupt interstate commerce. You can't stop someone who has a business from running their business. So there are rules about how you can protest. Can you block a street? No. A protest is not allowed to block a street. You're not allowed to stop pedestrians from walking down a sidewalk. You're allowed to gather, and you're allowed to gather in certain spaces where some protests are more allowed and welcome than others. You can stand on the steps in front of the State House and protest. You can't break the doors down of the State House and go in and start trashing the place.
So some of those things seem so logical and reasonable, and yet these boundaries are being pushed more than ever, especially of late. We understand that you have a right to protest, and in some cases you might need a permit, and with that permit might actually come the opportunity to block traffic. Around the time there was a protest heading up to the State House in front of what would be the Province Place Mall, a major thoroughfare, there was probably 20 minutes of protesters carrying signs, and they blocked traffic both ways. I thought, that's got to be illegal. Apparently not. It was during the George Floyd protest. They did have a permit, and they were allowed to do this. Under normal circumstances, you would not imagine that anybody would have a right to block traffic and block me from going up 610 connector or 95, and yet it happens.
So if you have a permit, and there are certain times where a permit would be required, if you don't have a permit, you can't block traffic. You can't block the sidewalk. But if there's a permit, sort of like a permit to have a parade, where you know a parade's going to block a street.
Exactly. Good example.
So if you have the proper permit and you've gone through the credentialing to get that, the rights of what you can do are expanded. But again, I would argue that if it becomes uncontrollable and it's created too much of a risk to the public, the police then have a right to ask you to control it, move it, or take it somewhere else.
And in many cases, it's not known how many people are going to be coming to a protest. You've planned for so many, and then it grows. You planned that you might block the streets for 5 minutes. That ended up being a lot longer, and there are countless other examples of when that happened. And of course, best known is the single largest protest, which was the George Floyd. I think it numbers 15 to 26 million during the time that was so very active. If they figured that they had a permit and they could block traffic for a short period of time, the police would have to stand down and allow that to happen unless there was some violence, unless someone's carrying clubs or whatever else that they shouldn't. But now the situation suddenly changes, and it's not within the realm of that permit. Now you have more police on the scene because you have more people on the scene. So these things continue to grow. Who's in charge? Who gets to determine? Who has the authority to determine you have to leave, you can't do this any longer? How does that become a lawful process without people getting, and they do, get more angry and then become violent? How do you manage that?
So first of all, you do have a right to assemble and you have the right to peacefully protest. When that becomes a danger to the public, then the police do have a right to, at that point, ask you to disperse. And the order to disperse has to be given with enough time for you to be able to do it. It has to be clearly articulated, and the police get to decide that, but it's really a very difficult line that you have to watch. The right to protest is a strong right protected under the Constitution, but the right for the public safety and the police to protect that is also very important. So when the police determine that we've come to a point where this is no longer a safe situation to continue, they can tell you to disperse, and they can tell you that we expect you to do it by a certain time. And When it becomes a little bit unruly and a little bit of a contest between those who are protesting and the policeman comes to you, I would suggest to you that if the police tell you to leave and you don't leave, then they do at that point probably have a right to arrest you. So my recommendation would be stay calm. Ask them if you're under arrest. If you're not under arrest, then just calmly leave.
So which police take care of what? What about jurisdictions? How does this work? If it happened in Seekonk, Mass, maybe you can't speak to Massachusetts. Okay.
Sure, we're here.
There's Seekonk or someplace in Johnston, Rhode Island, versus it's going to be a state issue versus it's a federal issue. Who gets to decide who has the authority over or jurisdiction over these
Well,
situations?
it's who has jurisdiction over the health and welfare of the public at large. So if you're in Providence and they're on the steps of the the Rhode Island State House, and things are getting out of control, and the Providence police are there, they have the right to control what's going on there, but so do the state police. And so there can be cross-jurisdiction or co-jurisdiction over certain things. And if you're on federal property, there could be federal marshals or the FBI if they determine that this is something that's above and beyond what normally would be expected. But certainly for the most part, it's usually a state issue and the state controlling its public welfare. So the first line of defense for that might be the city where it's occurring. The second line of defense might be the state police. And if it's something that's ongoing and becoming an issue, sometimes you even see governors threatening to call out the National Guard.
Okay. And when the police, as you mentioned earlier, might say, David, or not David, they wouldn't know your name, but time for you to move, sir.
Right.
Apparently, as we know, there have been times when, never mind protesters have done things that are not right. Police at times have done things that are not right. And I guess it was first labeled during the George Floyd issue, something called kettling, where police might corral the group of protesters, tell them they might or should be leaving, and do it within a certain period of time, except that if they're kettled or corralled, then that sort of keeps them, blocks them from doing it. Then they end up being trotted off to the local Huskow jail, and they end up being having their rights denied and violated, and that has happened. What do you do if you happen to be thinking that your rights have been violated? Maybe you didn't take out the cell phone, as we always say. Make sure you capture that video or capture that photograph.
Yeah.
So what do you do, David?
So, well, not me, but most people younger than me, I never see them walking around without the cell phone in their hand. So if you have the cell phone in your hand, videotape it. Have some evidence. If you remain calm and you're asking appropriate questions and it's the police who aren't being reasonable and you have it on video, it's very helpful. I would suggest that the things I said before is ask, am I under arrest? If you're telling me we have to disperse, you're not allowing us to leave. Why aren't you allowing us to leave? If we're under arrest, why are we under arrest? You're allowed to ask those questions.
And imagine recording it. Wouldn't that be terrific?
And that's what I'm suggesting, is I would have it recorded. Oftentimes, you would expect that the police would have body cameras. That's, I think, something that's pretty standard these days. So they're recording it. You should be allowed to record it too. You shouldn't be stopped from recording it. The police shouldn't say, put that away. Why? It's public record. I'm here. I should be allowed to record it.
Is it legal and or is it even wise to, if you do have a video or a camera, to take the police officer's picture and his badge number for reference later? Yeah,
so if you're approached by a policeman and you're at a protest and you ask the appropriate questions and you remain calm, and the police officer is being the aggressor, you certainly, I think, could ask him for his badge number, take his picture, even better, record it. And I would say, I hope your body camera's on to record it. This is mine. I'm recording it as well for your safety and mine.
Good. So now while we're trying to actually protect those who want to protest, how do things change, David, if you're not on public property in front of the State House, City Hall, 95? Suppose you want to protest on private property. Are any of the rules changed in that case?
Yeah, they are, because the owners of the property have rights too. And your right to protest and march and disrupt don't carry on to private property. And it reminds me a little bit back in the day where there were anti-abortion protesters. They couldn't go on the property of Planned Parenthood or wherever it was. If there was these massive protests and so forth, or even small ones, sometimes the police or security would come out and say, you're allowed to protest, but you have to be over there. And again, talking about interfering, they could yell and heckle, but they weren't supposed to interfere with somebody who was either working and going into or a patient at one of those clinics.
They can't block them from going in, certainly.
Exactly. So that's why I'm saying you can't be on the private property blocking it. And even on the sidewalk that could be considered public, if it was blocking someone from going in, the police had a right to ask you to move back.
If you're on private property and the homeowner or property owner says, yes, it's okay for you to put these banners up, balloons or whatever else you're using, you as the property owner, if it's supposed to be peaceable and then it isn't, are you liable?
So if you invite people on and you encourage them, are you asking if the property owner is liable to?
If something goes wrong. So it's planned to be a peaceable protest, but some others who were uninvited decided to be counter, because you have a right to protest. Counter protesters, are they allowed to be on that property? Or even if they're protesters and they go from being peaceable to suddenly violent, are you as the property owner, are you liable? Do you bear some responsibility for the outcome of that?
So if it's foreseeable, it's possible, I wouldn't want to take that risk. So as the property owner, you can choose who you want to have on your property. And so I would have a police security group there. And if people who weren't supposed to be there come on, I'd ask them to be removed, because it's your own private property. You're not required to allow anybody onto your property you don't want. It could be considered trespassing.
And again, take out that video camera or that camera just to make sure that these are mine, these are not my people. If you are arrested, there are degrees and I guess choices that police have about whether they issue a warning or whether they slap you in cuffs and those twist ties or whatever they call those, and take you down to the jailhouse. If you feel like you've been wrongly arrested, detained, even cited, what recourse after that event, when you're released, what recourse do you have? Because you'd like to, perhaps, make sure that these kinds of things don't happen again. Not that that ever happens, but say you want to register your complaints. What is your recourse? What can you do?
Well, there's a couple of different things you can do. So if it's a police department that has brought you in inappropriately, treated you incorrectly, again, it would be great if somebody was there who was a witness and you could get their name, or even better, have them videotape what was going on. I would take all the information I have and perhaps start by contacting the Internal Affairs Division or Board of the police department. Many larger police departments have, even smaller ones, a division that regulates how policing is done, and that's always a good place to start. If you're not getting anywhere with that, you could contact the ACLU, for instance, and say, you know, my rights were violated. Here's the situation, here's the evidence, and ask if there's anybody there who would be willing to help you. Sometimes they refer it out to a lawyer who might be interested in bringing, especially if it's not just one person, but more than one person.
Good point, too.
But those are the areas where I would start, particularly if it's just you, with the Internal Affairs Division.
Okay. So if a police officer says you are disruptive, we think you were going to be violent, that could be he said, she said, or whatever. How do you get to prove that you weren't going to become violent? How do they get to prove that you were? Unless you absolutely walked in with a loaded gun or the saber saw, how does that stand legally? You don't know what my intention might be unless it's very apparent, or you happen to catch it. How do you know what my intention is? Is that a legal call?
Well, again, it's what are you doing, and what are you saying, and how are you saying it, and are you threatening, and are you being disruptive, are you being combative? So if you're doing some of those things where it's clear that you're either out of hand already or going to be, then they need to take action to protect public safety. If you're not doing those things, then they really should, if they're at a point where the crowd is disruptive, ask you to disperse calmly. And again, that's the conversation where I say you remain calm. If you have free hands, you don't have a cell phone, just show them like that with my fingers open and my hands up, I'm leaving. And hopefully if something happens, somebody else has been able to record what's happening, and that would be the evidence you would produce. Because otherwise, without your witnesses, it's sort of a police said, you said kind of situation.
And of course, I want to speak to the other side of it in defense of police officers in a moment. But clearly, through the George Floyd protests, there were something like 633 issues that were made where police officers did not respect and didn't obey the laws as they are, or as they were at the time, and arrested people who said, sir, am I arrested? Sir, am I doing anything wrong? And clearly they weren't, but they had either black/brown skin and therefore were put in jail, and of course that will continue to play out. So there are certainly issues with police doing more policing than they could, should, ought, or whatever, and supposedly extending their ability to contain you. So let's speak to the other side of it now, because at times these protesters have endangered not only the public, but also police officers. How do police officers, under these circumstances where the rules are now changing and being debated, how do police officers get to stay safe and still be reasonable legally?
So for the most part, most police officers are just trying to do their job and keep the peace.
Fair enough, sure.
And so they have to use their judgment, and they have to try to remain calm themselves. And the best policing is when you can convince somebody, this is why you have to do what you have to do, and this is how you should do it. And the person who's being talked to remains calm, and the police officer remains calm. That doesn't happen a lot. Maybe it does happen a lot, but it's the best case scenario. Sometimes you can't talk reason with somebody and they're out of control. Then you as a police officer have to do whatever it is that you've been trained to do in the least physical way, I would say, that you can do it. So it's, what did you call those, tie twist or whatever, handcuffs type of thing. If you have to use them and you can do it safely, that's the best thing to do next, and try to control and contain what's going on. But it's really a fine line or balancing act that they have to do to protect themselves, and they are entitled to protect themselves, and they have rights too, versus not being overly aggressive.
So interestingly, in reading this, it doesn't really surprise me, but police officers have to endure a lot, and the right to protest, those protesters have a right to be disruptive and noisy, as we said earlier, but they're also allowed to curse them, and that certainly isn't fun, it isn't nice, it isn't respectful, but it also isn't illegal, and they have to endure that, which is interesting. So,
but they don't have to endure being physically threatened or being hit or anything of that nature. Having things thrown at them.
Good point. Right. So while we address these topics now, hoping to let people know what their rights are, what some of the rules are, clearly, of late, these rules are changing. There's I guess at least 8 states now that have signed on to changing and increasing the amount of criminal effect that's encompassing your right to protest. So in other words, we want to maintain some civility here. We want to make sure that there aren't violent outbreaks. It's the right of a citizen, I guess it's your right to protest, but also your right, you need to know what the laws are. How does one do that reasonably when these things are in flux right now? And clearly there are at least 8 states that have said we're going to increase our ability to restrict what you're able to do during these protests because so much has turned violent.
So the right to restrict your right to protest, your rights under the Constitution, under the First Amendment, that's something that if it goes too far can be challenged in court. And does that law pass constitutionality? Does it pass a constitutional review? If it does, Well, first of all, to answer your question, the best research you can do is to go online and, as I call it, Google whatever it is that you want to know and what are your rights in that state to protest and try to follow the rules. But if the rule is unreasonable and it's too restrictive and won't pass scrutiny under the Constitution, then sometimes people like to challenge the law just to be able to bring that suit.
Exactly.
And so you can do that. And it reminds me a little bit, it's slightly different, but the right to get a permit to have a parade, that really can't be limited by how distasteful either you are or what your message is.
Yes.
The government can't regulate what the message is. So no matter how abhorrent what you want to say is, how bad it is, you could get that right to get the permit to protest or parade or whatever, even if it's in a place that would be offensive. It reminds me of, I think it's Skokie, Illinois, and Nazis marching through a Jewish neighborhood. They had the right to do it. And I think it was a Jewish attorney who defended their right to do it.
Right, you would defend their right to do it if it's their right.
Exactly, because he's defending everybody's right to do it under the Constitution. But if the law is reasonable and would pass scrutiny, then you have to follow the law.
Sounds right. So apart from carrying banners and signs, even if people aren't violent to one another, there have been very many reports of statues being toppled. Never mind, thanks to Black Lives Matter, there are questions about what flags should be taken down and what statues should be taken down, and that can be a matter of discourse. But once those protesters decide that they will, I don't know, lasso the statue and take it down, is that part of a legal issue, or should they all be thrown in jail because that's not their property?
Well, it's not their property, and if you're destroying property that doesn't belong to you, it's still a criminal act, even if it is not something that you agree with or would want to see. There's a process for having things removed.
And what about the spray paint? You defiled the statue, you didn't knock it down. Is that illegal?
I think if you're defacing property that doesn't belong to you, it's still a criminal act. And whether or not the city or state or town wants to prosecute that, that's a different story, because there is prosecutorial discretion.
And I think there was one other point that was important. We've talked at times how we want to enable people who are watching the show to handle some issues themselves. If someone is arrested, they may or may not need a lawyer, but wasn't it interesting to read that before you protest, you should write your lawyer's name even on your arm in case you need to place that one call and the rest of your phones or whatever are taken away. Would you agree with that?
Yes, you have your rights, and one of them is the right to make that phone call, so have the number ready. Maybe notify the lawyer, hey, you may be getting a call.
Sounds like a good idea. Do you think most people should call a lawyer if they are in that situation because of what's been going on recently, especially?
I do. I mean, there are some things you can handle yourself, but if you're going to be charged with a crime, you should have some legal representation.
Sounds good. Well, whatever side of the protest issue you're on, we hope that this has been helpful to you. We hope you continue to stay tuned to The Law Matters. As we say, it matters to you. Thank you for tuning in.